Welcome to the Boston Public Library, WGBH's studio. My name is Phillip Martin. I'm a senior investigative reporter for WGBH in Boston and a contributor to PRI's The World. And we are going to have quite a show here today. This event is being sponsored jointly with WGBH, PRI's The World, and the Pulitzer Center. We're streaming live over the next hour on Facebook, as well as the Pulitzer Center site, so stay tuned. This program will include a brief question and answer. And for folks out in our live audience here, we're going to ask you to write down your questions on the cards that are being passed out right now or will be passed out in the next few minutes. Later in the program, I'll read some of your questions as they come in. This discussion tonight is an extension of our four-part WGBH and PRI The World series, Caste in America, sponsored by the Pulitzer Center. Special shout out at this moment to my colleagues on the series, reporters Tinku Ray, who's with us here at the library, Kavita Pillay, right on stage here. We have editors Ken Cooper, Aaron Schachter, and Monica Campbell, and photographer Meredith Neerman. What is caste, you might ask? Simply put, and I'll let the panelists elaborate as we go on, it's a form of social stratification characterized by religious and socially determined hierarchical status resulting in social and political privileges for some, exclusion for others. And it largely manifests in South Asia, but not exclusively. And I'm going to turn to our panelists to hear their take. Allow me first to introduce everyone. Right here, to my immediate right, we have Suraj Yengde. Suraj is a postdoctoral fellow at the Initiative for Institutional Anti-Racism and Accountability at Harvard Shorenstein Center, and India's first Dalit PhD holder from an African university. We're also joined, up from New York, by Swami Venkataraman. He's a member of the National Leadership Council of the Hindu American Foundation and the lead author of its report titled Not Caste, in Caste, Seeking an End to Caste-Based Discrimination. And right next to him is my friend Laurence Simon. I call him Larry Simon. He is a professor of international development and director of the Center for Global Development and Sustainability at the Heller School at Brandeis. He's also joint editor-in-chief of a new publication. You'll see the sign right out here. That publication is called Caste, a global journal on social exclusion. Next to Larry here is Kavita Pillay. I keep going back and forth between Kavita and Kavita, who I've called her that for years. But she's a documentary filmmaker and one of the reporters for the Caste in America series. She's reported from Singapore, from Poland, from India and Finland, and for PRI's The World, and is a not once but twice Fulbright scholar in India. Tarun Khanna is director of the Lakshmi Mittal and Family South Asia Institute, a professor at the Harvard Business School, and an expert on the economics of South Asia and China, the author of Billions and Billions of Entrepreneurs. I'm going to turn my attention right now to the panel. I'm going to ask them to elaborate, but briefly. It sounds like a contradiction, doesn't it? But we'll get into some of the meatier issues as we move along. But right now, I'd like to ask Suraj Yengde, we'll start with you. Talk about, if you will, the social position and conditions of Dalits, formerly known as Untouchables, their conditions in the United States, in the intersection, if you will, of Dalit rights movement and the Black Lives Matter movement, and other movements focused on racism in America. What's the connectivity and what is the scope of the Dalit movement, if you will?
Right. The Dalits, or what we call the former Untouchables, were the outcasts of the Indian Hindu order. So, according to the formation, the Ubermensch, the Brahma, and there is a stratification, and so you go from top to bottom, and so there are Brahmins, then there are warriors or kingly class, then there is business class, and there are working, the peasants and Shudras. And there is a fifth category which is outlawed as a human being, which is not considered, and those are untouchables. and untouchables are unseeable, these are polluted people. Now, the relation that it has in America is there are 4 million Indians or people of Indian origin who reside in America. Of that 4 million, there is an increasing surge of Indians by way of 2 major migration. One is students. Last year, it was recorded close to 200,000 Indian students came to study in America. And with the H-1B status, the skilled labor force that come, India ranks top. People from India who are coming as working, who are joining the labor market are the top. At the student intake level, India is second to China when it comes to contributing. So there is this immense amount of contribution. In addition to that, what we have is the people who are applying for green card or who are becoming naturalized in this country, and there are close to 47% who are eligible and who are getting naturalized as US citizens. In addition to that, we have the people who are also becoming the permanent residents or green card holders. Now, this is a massive force. And now in America, this becomes important because these are the people who are movers and shakers predominantly in many fields. You have Sundar Pichai leading Google India, and then we have Satya Nadella, the Microsoft CEO. Then we have Kamala Harris. We have Hassan Minhaj. We have Aziz Ansari. We have Bobby Jindal. These are very influential people. And when we talk about these people, we are actually talking about existence of caste that comes along with them.
Hold that thought. I appreciate that. Swami, the Hindu American Foundation has a different take on how you define caste, or at least how it manifests in the United States. Your position has been that you're anti-caste discrimination. Elaborate, please.
So, I mean, I think it's very absolutely as Suraj says, caste discrimination has been a historic problem in the country. And it is our duty as Hindus to grapple with the issue until it's completely eradicated. India has come a long way since independence in terms of the kind of affirmative action policies that have been put in place, but there's still a long way to go. So there's no question about denying or minimizing the seriousness and the extent of the problem. It's for that purpose that we compiled this report as well that you mentioned when introducing me, bringing together religious leaders, getting them to affirm that caste-based discrimination has no place in Hinduism, and bringing together a wider body of research to create better understanding of this problem. So where, if there is a difference, is that perhaps we disagree in some ways to the extent to which the interpretation of Hindu scriptures are said to be the source and the inspiration behind caste discrimination, and where caste discrimination is considered to be an essential part of the practice of Hinduism. Our position is that caste discrimination is no more essential to Hinduism than slavery or racism are essential to Christianity. They are both social evils. They both have to be eliminated. It is the responsibility of the societies that created these problems to deal with them and eradicate them. There's no question about it. But that's where in fact, we think that caste discrimination is in many ways antithetical to the most fundamental teaching of Hinduism, namely that divinity resides in every individual, not just every individual, but in all living beings, entirely. So we think that is where we might differ with a lot of activists. In terms of America, sorry, were you going to ask me something?
Hold that thought, Swami.
Right.
I'm going to turn to you. We're going to come right back to this issue, of course.
Okay.
And I'd like to turn to Larry Simon, who has been also focused on caste for many years as an academic at Brandeis University, starting again the first journal that's coming out in April on caste. And you have also convened three, not one, but three conferences on caste in South Asia and here in the United States. You heard from both Suraj and Swami. What is, in fact, the nexus of the objective aspects of this issue that basically allow us to understand why we're even having this discussion, caste? What does it even matter?
Well, thank you, Philip. I think to best answer that question, let me tell you just a little personal note first, and also something about the founding of Brandeis University, which would kind of explain better to our audience why we have taken on the issue of caste for a study. My grandparents came from Tsarist Russia around 1900, and they left because of caste-like oppression under the Tsars. They came to America and they were hoping for a better way of life, and they certainly found that. In 1 or 2 generations, our family has certainly done well. But we know, if just looking at the destruction of Jewish graves outside of Boston in the recent days, that the oppression or some attitudes from the old Europe have somehow come into our lives here in the United States also. The Brandeis itself was founded because Jewish youth in 1948 could not get into most of the Ivy League schools except in very small numbers. Because again, there were certain attitudes, not only about Jews, but about all minorities, frankly, about their capacity and what it meant to be in the Ivy League schools. But our founding president said that Brandeis should be a host to all the nations of the world, to all the peoples of the world. And so the work that we've been doing on caste is very much an outgrowth of, kind of in our DNA, if you will. It's really an outgrowth of our concerns about social exclusion anywhere we find that. And to come up to the present, over the years, I think, as you know, I've created scholarships for Dalit youth from India and elsewhere to come to our programs, our graduate programs. And I was really quite astounded about 10 years ago when some of our new students from the Dalit community would come over and very quietly tell me that they were feeling ostracized by some other Indian students on campus from high caste backgrounds. Now, not all high caste students, of course, but they carried with them a kind of stigma from the old country, from India, and a concern that they would not be accepted here. One of my students, Phillip, and I'll end with this, one of my students said that after 2 weeks at Brandeis, that it was the first time in his life that he felt anonymous, and he loved it, meaning that everyone around him did not identify a kind of stigma that he would wear on his lapel in parts of India where caste is still strong.
Thank you. Kavita, you have, we were talking about this, and you mentioned that caste was not something you've really thought about growing up here in the United States. You chose in part 3 of our series, Caste in America, to focus on your parents, when you did think about it, because they come from a inter-caste marriage. And you also decided to focus on the group known as the Nairs. You attended a conference out in Chicago to basically look at the connections between your parents' lives and this group that formed a caste. Why did you choose to focus on your parents, and what is the connection to the folks you found out in Chicago at this conference you attended last summer?
Well, initially, I had hoped that you would focus on my parents and that I could do another story in the series. And then at your behest and in talking with our colleagues, I realized that I was kind of a stand-in for the listeners. Because as you said, I grew up not thinking about caste. And so I didn't know a lot about it. And I realized that if I structured the story as a reporter's journey, going through this process of hearing my parents' story, going to this convention of people from my dad's caste, I could take listeners on the same journey that I was going through. In doing so, I realized that by talking about my mom is from a lower caste, and by mentioning that just in a very small, tiny way, I could help destigmatize talking about having lower caste lineage. But in talking about my dad's caste, my dad is from an upper dominant caste, the Nairs from Kerala. And by talking about that, I could look at caste privilege, which is in truth what I had not really thought about, because the privilege of privileges, you don't have to think about it. It's the water to the fish. It infuses everything, even if you cannot see it. And so because the vast majority of Indians and Hindus in this country come from India's upper and dominant castes, it suddenly shifted my understanding of the Indian experience in this country. Because we tend to look at Indian success in terms of education, very high education levels, very high income levels in this country as the proximal reason for that is, well, the US cherry picks people from India and brings them over, and it's easier for them to come. But the ultimate reason is that you have this system in India in which certain people are already getting into certain kinds of schools, exposed to certain kind of English language proficiency, getting certain kind of STEM education. And so suddenly caste privilege became a lot more important to understand. Also, when we started interviewing Dalits in the Boston area, one guy put it so potently. He said, we Dalits want to know, what is it that the upper caste and dominant caste say about caste in their own living room? And when he said that, I realized, I've had that thought when I see reports about issues relating to women. I've had that thought when I see issues relating to race. Why is it always women have to comment on women's issues? Why is it that brown and black people always have to comment on issues about race? What about getting men to examine their own privilege? What about getting white people to examine privilege? So I thought, this is what I can do. I can go to this conference and connect it to my parents' story for this particular part of the series.
This is fascinating, and I'd like to again to get right back to aspects of what each of you have talked about, but we're going to turn to, at this point to Tarun Khanna, because Tarun, you as a professor, distinguished professor of business at the Harvard Business School, and also you were in the South Asia Center at Harvard. There's sort of a macro aspect of this that I'd like you to address. In your book, Billions and Billions of Entrepreneurs, I've always wondered how many among them were Dalits. and I'm wondering who basically gets to take that journey from India, if you will, that Kavita referred to the United States to perhaps prosper at places like Google and Microsoft. And does caste have any bearing on that, in your view?
So first I should say I'm not an expert on caste at
That's
all.
right.
But I am intellectually and as an activist and entrepreneur very interested in social exclusion of all sorts. And Kavita just referred to it through gender, race, what have you. That's what I've spent the last 20 years combating through my writings and through my own activism. We've also been running a very interesting project on meritocracy, where we are juxtaposing the idea of merit as an organizing principle in India and in China, and by extension in the United States. So whatever I say is drawn from this pool of incidents so far. I think there's no question, nobody on the panel is contesting the idea that people who are identified with lower caste in India experience all sorts of disadvantages to getting to the same point. My point of connection to this is, again, as an activist, is to say, what can I do about it? There are other people on the panel who are sensibly debating or contesting the origins of this discrimination, whether it's intrinsic to Hinduism or whether it's an artifact of some other social practice that's emerged over centuries. I'm interested in knowing what can I do about this. So one of the things that we did with some young kids from MIT and IIT is start an organization called Aspiring Minds. I'm an applied mathematician by training, and we decided that we would use artificial intelligence to test people independent of caste, creed, background, or gender for any occupation anywhere in the world. Today we test 5 to 6 million people a year, kids all around the world, and we get them entry. We're essentially mainstreaming them into world society as best as we can using technology. Now I'm not naive. I don't think technology is the answer to everything, but I think that is an interesting aspect of the conversation that we should engage with and say, is that a tool for policymaking that can get around some of the issues of discrimination that are so endemic and that none of us would contest?
That's a great way to transition to the second part of this discussion, which is more freewheeling, if you will. Ask a question, and any of you can answer this. In fact, I would hope that all of you would answer. But one way of addressing disparities in India, which translates to the United States, in India is the reservation policy. The policy, the practice, constitutionally sanctioned, actually sanctioned through amendments, and I don't think originally part of the Constitution, right? But huh?
Dr. Ambedkar had it in the Constitution.
That's right. Okay. Well, the point is, you have reservations that basically reserve some jobs, places in school for scheduled castes, for Dalits. And wondering if you feel that affirmative action, another way of putting this, is the best way to basically create a level playing field from India to the United States, if you will, for Indians.
So I'm not sure that I would jump to affirmative action to bring people from India to the United States. I think affirmative action definitely has a role to play, a big role to play in a society where significant numbers of people have been disadvantaged for a long time, much as the same debates that we have here. But my guess is that, my intuition is that in India we ought to be doing significantly more for basic education, basic information, basic health care, for a vast collection of disadvantaged people. And any way you cut it, that will intersect very strongly with the lower caste society. But whether you should intervene with reservations for coming to the United States, that part I'm not sure
I guess the thrust of my question really is, when you have it in India, does it naturally lead to people ascending up the ladder and thus become qualified, if you will, by virtue of their education, to apply for many of the same visas, for example, H-1B visas, and school that upper caste Indians have applied for over the years? That becomes the essence of the question.
I would agree with that. I mean, I come from India, so my experience is that it is indeed true that the policy of reservations has given a lot more opportunities to people who did not have that before. And so some of them make the choice to move to the US. And maybe if that opportunity did not exist, maybe they would not have been able to do. But I agree with Tarun in the sense that reservations fundamentally is an important aspect of giving more opportunities. I wouldn't see getting people to the US as an objective. I would see that as more of a personal decision that people make. But I agree with the idea of reservations, yes.
Right.
I would actually agree that, first I'd like to say that the reservation system in India should not be a ceiling on, like a quota system, that is a ceiling on how many people come from depressed communities, but rather should really be considered just an entree, to a great many more that could gain higher education. Whether that should be a portal to come to the United States, I'm not sure that should be the objective of a reservation system or even of the higher education system in India. But I would say that I think that it would be wonderful if American, including the Brandeis International Business School, but other prominent business schools in the United States, if they had an opportunity for students from the reservation system or others to come to the Harvard Business School, the Brandeis International Business School, and so forth, to gain the kinds of skills that are necessary for the kind of upward mobility that is very powerfully done through business, through entrepreneurship, and to return to India. In other words, I'm certainly delighted when Indians come to the United States for a whole variety of reasons. But the real point of education is to try to help India in its transformation to not only a first world economy, but a first world society.
Okay.
If I may add one point there. I also think that as much as education, it's owning businesses that has the greater potential to transform the Dalit community in India. As part of HAF, we are in touch with a body known as the Dalit Indian Chamber of Commerce and Industry, run by a gentleman called Milind Kamble, who's based in Maharashtra. And I think some of those ideas are very good. They are focused on creating a bank of capital to help people from Dalit backgrounds start businesses.
You're not talking about micro-lending. You're talking about something more
Not
expansive.
necessarily micro-lending. It's just access to capital and access to expertise to manage and run businesses. That can be a critical thing as well. So there are other areas that are sort of important to things like this.
Suraj, what's your view about that?
I think this is a neoliberal intervention to the problems of the people who are oppressed, to offer a dream of a certain sort where we can aspire, and this aspirational capitalism doesn't work with the people who are deeply embedded in social hierarchies. So even if we have this Dickey, again, it's a product of RSS, a right-wing kind of a manipulation. This guy who runs this Milind Kamble is a cadre of these Brahminical parties, this whole cadre camp. And so him using as an epitome to represent the entire Dalit community is actually quite dangerous. And how many Dalit capitalists do we have? It's countable, and it's laughable at the same time. They are mostly looking for the capital that comes from the state, and that too not from the Ministry of Finance. It's the Ministry of this micro-scale industries. It's not even, and that to some percentage of it. So this aspiration could work well if we have a society that honors meritocracy sans all the social kind of disabilities we have. But right now, even if I'm an entrepreneur, and we have had these cases, we just don't get enough adequate space into the market because this market is a banya kind of extension of this. And so unless you come, and I think Tarun and his colleagues, Ashutosh and Lakshmi, had done this research where they found that, even in how much of the entrepreneurs, or rather the CEOs who sit in chambers, 48% of them are Brahmins, and Brahmins constitute only 3% of India's population.
Would some argue, however, that it's just one modality of going up the rung of the ladder, just one way, and perhaps there can be an endorsement of that one way among a myriad of ways?
One of the ways, but that should not be. That's my whole problem. My contestation is that should not be seen as this beacon light where we are offering the Dalits this dream when, Dalits they are the most impoverished people in India. Only less than 3% Dalits graduate with a university degree. Now you tell me 97% of the people don't even have university bachelor's or qualifications to go into the market. Who are we catering to? This very micro percentage of the people, and that's where we have a problem.
Kavita, what your view on this?
That's it. I actually don't necessarily have a view on this particular thing, but I think more of my exposure to reservations came when I was at this convention and people were talking about so-called reverse discrimination. So I haven't really explored it in terms of the Dalit experience.
But what you experienced was a pushback
Right.
to this issue.
Right.
One of the other questions I'd like to ask, and I think it is a related question, is you mentioned the RSS. Right now, India has its own charismatic leader, Prime Minister Modi, who is, by all accounts, very popular, but also very controversial. Pretty much as Donald Trump is very popular among some and very controversial. Here, one of the questions, hi there, I'm looking out the window here, the kids looking in. I got briefly distracted. I'm wondering if you could tell me what impact has Prime Minister Modi had on caste relations, and does that translate in any way to the view of caste and the discussion around caste here in the United States? We got silence on this one.
I've not perceived any direct link to the discussion in the United States. Can I make a comment on the previous?
Please.
Previous discussion. In a sense, it's hard to. One of the barriers, and Suraj alluded to a study that I had done with Ashu Varshni, who is a professor at Brown, and Lakshmi Iyer, who's a professor at Notre Dame, looking at the representation of caste in positions of political leadership and economic leadership. And what we found was over the last several decades, the lower caste folks in India had generally dramatically increased their representation in political power. They were variety, and we know this, that there's a lot of caste-based politics that happens at the retail level across India.
That's right.
And it's an issue in and of itself. But when we look for, one might expect that that political power might have translated into economic power as well. Suraj is right on that there's no evidence that any of the political power has translated into economic power. And I think that gives us a lot of pause because it's been a long time. So clearly whatever we're doing is not working. So, but I don't agree with Suraj's sort of reaction to Swami's statement about the pool of capital. How could you argue with the existence of a pool of capital? That's got to be a good thing. But he's right that that's not necessarily what an economist would call the binding constraint, that there's so many other constraints that have to be alleviated before the capital becomes meaningful. And I think primarily among that is the existence of role models and paths to education and things of that nature. So I think we should celebrate Suraj because he's people like that can be role models. For in India and show ways forward in some ways. Yeah.
What you're also saying is you could make juxtapositions, and I'm not sure positions are always correct, to the situation in the United States, where you saw post-civil rights movement, quite a few African Americans ascend politically, but not necessarily sharing in proportionate numbers.
You're seeing it in South Africa right now, right?
In South Africa, yeah.
In a big way. You have a small, entrenched BEE, Black Economic Empowerment elite.
Right.
But the average black person in the street has not at all benefited from Mariba's sacrifices.
That's right. Cyril Ramaphosa and others did well in the post-apartheid era. But are those juxtapositions in a broader sense fair to juxtapose issues of race with issues of and issues of caste? Wondering if you could talk about that. Have you ever made those juxtapositions yourselves to try to understand how caste impacts one set of Indians and Nepalis, for example, in this country? Is that a fair juxtaposition?
I certainly had my perspective on this just blown wide open when I heard Isabel Wilkerson talk about this. Isabel Wilkerson being a Pulitzer Prize winning historian and journalist who has looked at this very issues of race in America very deeply and made really potent analysis of like the hallmarks of the caste system in India and hallmarks of racial hierarchies in the US. And a handful of things that she pointed to were endogamy, which is the fancy name for who marries who.
Who marries who, that's
who marries who. Also, ideas about purity and pollution, right? Think about lower caste being polluting and think about, our one-drop rule here in the US or separate water fountains or separate bathrooms. These things that were both cultural but also like legislated for a significant amount of time. But also these are constructs. Race and caste are socially constructed stories or myths with real potent effect on generations, on centuries of both of these countries. Or also say the reaction to affirmative action in the US versus the reactions to reservations in India. I think there is a conversation to be had there. Not that they are the same, but that these are experiences that, as Indians or as Americans or as Indian Americans, we can understand the social hierarchies and why they are so entrenched by understanding something about each of them.
Just want to mention to our audience, we're broadcasting live here at the Boston Public Library, focused on the issue Caste in America, also the name of our series on WGBH and PRI's The World. We're going to continue this discussion, a few more questions, and the third part of this, a few minutes from now, we'll turn to our audience. They're going to have passed out some cards with questions on them, and we're going to address them to you. But right now, I have another question. I'm sorry, Larry, go on.
Okay, thank you, Philip. Just to follow up on the previous question, race and caste certainly are distinct in many ways, but I think where the commonality really is in the legacies of oppression. I mean, in the United States, in India and in Nepal and perhaps other parts of South Asia to a lesser extent, caste is well over 1,000 years old. I mean, untold centuries of, let's put it bluntly, of oppression against low caste people, and particularly the outcasts of the society. Hopefully that is changing now, but it is still, the legacy is very powerful. We had 250 years of slavery in the United States. Then we had 100 years at least of the oppressive laws of the South, right? The Jim Crow era in the South. Whatever progress has been made, the legacies of oppression still haunt America, I think. The legacy of oppression in India, I think, is going to continue to haunt India and other South Asian nations, and to some extent, the diaspora that comes to the United States. We realize it's it's more muted here, obviously. And I think generation after generation, the limitations of caste among the Indian diaspora will fall away more and more, of course. But I think it's very hard for societies to overcome the legacies of oppression without taking dramatic action to correct those legacies, to correct it through social policies.
Thank you, Larry.
See, so sort of addressing the question of race and caste, and also piggyback from what Larry said. See, when we talk about Jim Crow era, right, a bunch of laws, the Hinduism that existed in the Smritis is a bunch of laws. But that had for extension of legislated discrimination, legislated authority to oppress the other person. The Manusmriti, which was a doctrine that was basically this injunctions upon the person who were belonging to the quote-unquote lower caste people. But the similarities of race and caste, in addition to this legislated form of discrimination, is that the Indians who come to India are not necessarily coming from India only. We have to make that distinction, because Indian diaspora is in more than 80 countries.
Yeah, that's true.
And they practice their own set of Hindu religion.
So coming from Uganda, at one point coming from South Africa,
or Caribbean,
Malaysia, or the Caribbean.
Yeah.
That's right.
So when they are coming in this country, they also carry those set of practices. So we don't want to discount them on that front. Mm-hmm. So in race and caste, we can go about intellectualizing this topic, but one striking feature is that until 1970s, we in America didn't have clear racial categories, so to say, and then it became eventually, first of all, it was called Asians, all Asians, then they were, Caucasians, and they were what they call Negroids categories until 1950. 1970s, we see an era where more regional representation is being discussed, where we have Asian Americans, African Americans, and on and on. And now I think this is about time where people, again, this is a generalized way of looking at it, African American, that there are many other categories that exist among African Americans too, and they have their own unique histories too. Similarly, when we talk about the South Asian experience, caste becomes this important intervention, and therefore, people like Isabel Wilkerson and many other scholars, the American South discrimination was known as American racial caste system, because that's how sets of groups where they come together, they form a caste, and caste is all about hierarchies within hierarchies. And I think this is an important intervention that if this 21st century American public could make, then will be help actually embolden those voices which get eventually masked.
You make an important point. But the whole notion of progress, how do you measure progress in that context among South Asians, specifically among Dalits? Here in Boston, for example, and you might find in Washington and around the country, you find successful Dalit chemical engineers, you find successful financial analysts, you find professors, and many would say they've done well in the United States. In that context, why is caste even relevant in the United States, given those social conditions and the relativism of their positions to India in the United States?
Do you mean why is it important among Indian Americans?
Yeah, why are we even having this discussion?
Yeah,
for example.
Still overwhelmingly, the vast majority of Indians and Hindus in this country are coming from the upper and dominant caste. So I think understanding that helps us understand that it's, we know, when I was doing the story, I realized I know how my parents came here with one suitcase and a handful of dollars. And vast majority of my Indian American friends also have similar stories. But we make it seem like it started at that, and they came here like with the hungry masses yearning to breathe free. But if caste is helping set them up in certain ways, then it's important to understand the privileges that caste has afforded for them to come here, do well, for their children, people like me, to do well, for my children to basically be born on, third base and halfway to home. And so to know that these things are not happening in a vacuum. We don't all come here equally, right? But also I think it's important in an era when we have increasingly very simplistic narratives, like you're either marginalized or you're privileged. Mm-hmm. I felt it was important to kind of muddle that a bit, and that was why intentionally in my story I made the point that I am both privileged and marginalized. Because in an era where we're getting this both sides terminology thrown at us day in, day out, I think it's more and more important for us to say there's rarely just two sides to anything.
We also had a situation, for example, when a gunman murdered two Indian men in the Midwest, in I think it was Missouri or was it Kansas, a year and a half ago. I don't think he asked, "Are you Dalit or are you Brahmin?" He shot to death two men he saw as outsiders. Does that so that becomes the context for many Americans, that you are other, and in that context, why should the discussion within Indian communities around caste matter in the broader context that you're dealing with in 2019 America?
See, I think
just turn to Tarun for a second. Go to Tarun and then Suraj.
So, Phillip, when I ran into you in Harvard Square and you said you were going to do this study of caste, I assumed you were going to do the study of caste in India. And when you said caste in America, I must confess I said, why? It can't really be that central because I never thought about it. And then I was reading through your website and different people's testimonials, and there was one in there that was very poignant to me, because it said, if you are from the upper caste, you don't need to think about it. But if you're from the lower caste, somebody will tell you you're from the lower caste. And I realized that my perspective was kind of myopic. But I also wanted to advance a simple-minded model, if you will, of transitions, which is simply that if you are disadvantaged, it's very difficult for you to break into the economic mainstream and the social mainstream, right? But once you make that transition, through hook or by crook, luck, reservations, serendipity, what have you, then, well, you're just there, and now you can participate I don't think in 25 years of teaching at Harvard, I don't think I've ever looked around and wondered whether one of my South Asian students is a Dalit or a Kshatriya or a Brahmin. I couldn't care less. They're just there. Now, I accept that for some of them to get there must have been a Herculean task. Right? But once they're there, they're there. So I think we ought to draw that distinction. But to me, it's been really eye-opening to engage with your intellectual experiment.
All right. Thank you, Tarun.
See, I mean, so many people from India come to this country, or also South Asia, and one of the peculiarity of caste is it's a shame. It's the stigma, and so you want to leave that baggage. But when you come across, and for example, I'm sitting next to Swami, I'm immediately intimidated, or Tarun, because by their name I know what caste they belong to, and then I'm immediately shown this in my own kind of inferior build-up that was told to me that you are inferior. Although we are sitting as equals, but my mind is not conditioned to think me as equal. And because of that is representative of many of the technological or many entrepreneurs who are Dalits who left India but managed to sort of disown their caste. By doing that, what they did was to disown their own identity.
Disowned by their obfuscating their last name, or what?
And also by just last name is one of the indicators, but also going to the festivals, for example, in every technological company, any company, there are Indian groups, and they have their own small little celebration of their own various gods. And many times the Dalits don't feel that because they have not brought up in this situation. So they don't they don't feel that they belong, but eventually they have to give. Right. But when they have to celebrate their own gods or their own festivals, they just don't have anyone else to celebrate to. And I think this is what this has been done, where I have to shed off my own skin and I have to disown my own ancestors because this is the shame I'm still carrying. I'm not like for example, Swami will not, or anyone will not come up and tell me, okay, never mind, we will still work on equal and we'll not only celebrate our own, but we'll also pay attention to who is the most vulnerable. And that is what is, I think, where the buck stops here.
I think there's another dimension to why discussion of caste in America is so important, and specifically with higher education. At one point I started to do a survey of South Asian studies programs around the United States, including my own at Brandeis University. And I began to realize that a lot of the South Asian courses on South Asian studies courses on religion or on 20th century history of India, if you look at the curriculum, caste is invisible. Caste is not addressed. Some places, yes. We have a course at Brandeis for undergraduates where it is very much front and center, but that's not the norm. How many courses on South Asian history in American universities address Dr. Ambedkar?
I can tell you why that's a good question.
Right.
Because until I started researching this topic, I had never heard of Dr. Ambedkar.
Right, I appreciate
and
that.
I found it extraordinary, the enormity of this man's contribution, not just to India, but to the discourse on democracy worldwide, and the discourse on social economics worldwide.
Yeah.
And I just had to mention that because I'm a pretty learned person, and I had not come across Dr. Ambedkar, and I found that to be extraordinary. Please continue.
Right. But I'm one of the members of our journal's editorial advisory board is the great American philosopher Martha Nussbaum. And Martha talks about the rise of women's studies programs in the United States. She says that the reason that they began to be developed in the US is because women got fed up studying history with very, very little reference to women. In other words, and she makes the point that if women are invisible in the curriculum, then they don't count. The point here being is that if caste is not, if particularly low caste Dalit people are not part of the histories taught in American universities, then they don't count. And that has to be addressed. So that's why caste in America, I think, particularly with respect to higher education, is a very important topic for us to think about and learn from.
I actually think
Swami,
that the reality in schools might be a little different because when you look at what happens in schools, just to give a story that came to us is you have maybe in 6th grade or something you have for a few days you have South Asian or Indian religions and culture covered, just a few days. And during those few days, at least in this thing that came to us, basically the teacher apparently picked 3 or 4 students, and then they were told, okay, you are a Brahmin, you are a Kshatriya, you are a Vaishya, you are a Shudra, you are a Dalit, and now act. You have to discriminate against this person. You have to insult that other person, and effectively, the Hindu kids in the class experience that is effectively as bullying in terms of what the kids later on spoke to them about Hinduism. Now, there is the contradiction here, which I think your original question brought out really well, which is there is the very sad reality of caste in India and the history of caste in India. And there is also the question of how to deal with that in this country in terms of, so one issue that the HAF has had is that, at least at the school level, the teaching of Hinduism seems to begin and end with caste. And we have questioned why not give such a prominence to slavery or other social evils found in other religions. Most other religions are dealt with respect to their core spiritual teachings, whether it's Christianity or Islam or Buddhism. Hinduism seems to have an overwhelming focus on the social problem of Hindu society, very real problem. No one can deny that. But does Hinduism begin and end with caste? And that's where the difference is. So when you talk about caste in India, caste in the US or how to deal with caste in the US, I agree to a large extent in terms of what Tarun said, is when you're here, you're here. where there is a real problem, so if temples are discriminating against Dalits who come into the temple, that needs to be dealt with. And we have said publicly that we work with temple management committees for various reasons. How to make temples more attractive to the next generation, for example, right? Nobody goes to temples anymore under the second and third generations. So we deal with these things. We work with managements to make sure that there cannot be that people of any caste cannot be made to feel uncomfortable or unwelcome in a place of worship where they choose to come. So we work on that. There's a need to deal with that within society if it exists. But what we also find is that largely knowledge and awareness of caste ends with the generation that comes into this country. The process of assimilation and the process of acculturation.
I must take issue with that a little bit, and perhaps try to stimulate another part of this conversation, is Equality Labs, which is, I think, the only organization that's thus far done any type of survey, though its methodology has been questioned, found that many Dalits in the United States basically do, in fact, feel levels of intimidation. I don't know about the systemic aspect of caste in the United States. We looked at many anecdotes, including in part 2 of our report, Tinku Ray interviewed a woman who was allegedly sexually assaulted because of her caste. It was felt. We interviewed a restaurant, a lawyer who represents a restaurant worker in New York who left under duress, feeling that he had been isolated and excluded from the restaurant staffing during moments of when they rested, basically, in between breaks, that he had been excluded. And that case is now before the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission. Again, I don't know about the systemic aspects of this, but there is a lot of anecdotal evidence to suggest that caste has followed many people to the United States. And I'm just wondering if, as a last question before we get to those I'm going to read from our audience, I'm just wondering what has been your own experiences with this issue, and does any of that, which I just cited, ring true for you? Suraj?
See, because the way we've been conditioned is not to own yourself up, and that was very peculiar in how I performed and not performed in special South Asian circles. Most of the time when I came, I chose to go to Department of African and African American Studies and not South Asia Institute or department that we have, because I thought this will be again the space which will not allow me to think the way I should think. And it was the African American Studies department and the scholars like Henry Louis Gates Jr. and Cornel West who kind of embraced what kind of work I was doing. And that was kind of space where I got, and eventually when I started hanging out with South Asianists, I mean, a recent incident, Harvard Kennedy School, I have a position there, and a student who was from a Brahmin caste, and we had a meeting, she started yelling at me for a very, in a very disparaging way, because there was an incident where she could have communicated, but she felt that she had this, this kind of mentality that he's this another Dalit, doesn't matter what. And that was very humiliating to get that from a student who's just first year, to kind of receive that kind of treatment at Harvard Kennedy School.
How do you know it was caste related?
Because when I inquired about this question, because she knows the politics that I deal with, and when we were engaging in a conversation that preceded with a conversation about, there is a politician from a lower caste, Lalu Prasad Yadav, they had a very negative comments about him. And I kind of took on that this is not fair. And after that even unfolded, put in with this very mentality of putting me down. Although they were not planning to do it, but they just did it. And this is what I'm trying to say. It's like nobody is carrying this thought to put me down, but you just carry it and you just execute it.
You're talking about, well, I assume you're talking about subconsciously. Is that what you're saying?
That's what I'm.
Folks, this is an extraordinary conversation. And I'd like to turn to some questions from our audience. But let me also mention that after the Facebook Live aspect of this, we're going to go on as long as we can and the Pulitzer Center aspect of this. Pulitzer Center is also broadcasting this live on Facebook. We're going to take another half an hour because this topic's so extraordinary to continue to engage in this discussion about caste in America. I'm going to turn to some questions as the third part of this discussion from our audience, live audience here, and from our Facebook Live audience. And they've asked a few questions. I'm going to throw a few of these out, and you answer these as you will. The first question, I'm going to take, let's try three at one time. How would you address the thought that Dalits are in their position because of culture and practice instead of something problematic? I don't know if you want to write that down. Should I ask that question again? How would you address the thought that Dalits are in their position because of culture and practice instead of something problematic? What this person seems to be asking is it because of culture or is it because of caste? This person seems to be asking.
I think that's ridiculous, frankly. I mean, I think if you look at the history of India, the first evidence of the beginning of untouchability, by the way, there's no Hindu text or even the Manusmriti that Suraj mentioned. There's no text where you ever find untouchability defined. That did not exist. The first evidence that this practice started came around the 6th century, around that time, around the 5th and 6th centuries. And so if you think about the history of India, which goes back at least 2,000 years before that, if not more, what they're arguing is these are people who are not untouchables before that point in time, who became untouchables. Now, we can argue why it happened and how it happened, but there was certainly nothing about their culture before that, that caused them to become untouchables. So clearly, it was a social problem that started. So I think I would rightly say anybody who hears that would be offended. It's just an absurd statement. It is clearly a social evil that started at a point in time. And it's the responsibility of the society to find ways to make amends for it.
Anyone else? Comment? Okay, thanks, Swami. We're going to turn to, here's another question from our audience. Caste was a word created by British people to look down on Indians and to say they discriminate. However, the British were the epitome of discrimination. Why did you pick caste as the word for the journal? This is obviously directed at Larry Simon.
Well, it's actually a very good question. I mean, caste is an English word, but we know that it has origins also, the English word also has origins in Portuguese, where the Portuguese were distinguishing in their colonies between pure lineage from Portugal, pure Portuguese lineage, and those in the colonies that either intermarried with somebody from Portugal or not. So it began to mean the concept of the purity of lineage. Now, if you really carry that out to social relations, you see the beginnings of discrimination and even in some situations of outright oppression. But we adopted the word caste, and it's Caste: a global journal on social exclusion, because we want to look at caste-like or birth-based hierarchies in other cultures, in other countries. That are the scholarship of the journal is not just going to be on South Asia, although that will be the locus, I think, the locus of activity there. If that's
okay. I'm looking at the clock. We're winding down the Facebook live aspect of this. We still have another minute, so I'm going to ask another quick question. And that question is, wow, if I can read this, it's not just Hinduism, it's also Christianity, Buddhism, Islam. Can you talk about caste in that context?
Are they saying that in India?
They're saying, someone seems to be suggesting that that is simply not a question.
It is pretty widespread among all the religions of South Asia, including Christianity, where Dalits are often not allowed to be cremated in the same, buried in the same cemetery or attend the same church. There is caste hierarchies among Muslims. It starts with those descended directly from invaders from Persia or the Middle East versus those who are converted, and then many divisions within them. So yeah, it is a reality. It is a reality among all the religions of South Asia.
Of course, those are minority religions, which in India, which are, influenced by the majority, right? We're not saying that Buddhists in China and Buddhists in Japan are practicing caste. It's like Christians in other parts of the world are practicing caste. We're saying specifically Christians, Muslims, Sikhs, others in India are practicing caste.
But I think it supports Suraj's point, right, which is that when somebody, a lower caste person, transitions to a different society, as Suraj would describe it, he's taking some of that psychological baggage with him. So probably it's the same extrapolation in India, where people who converted to different religions took along their experiences with them and were unable to shake them off.
Okay, my apologies. I'm going to ask for the Facebook Live aspect of this discussion, and we will continue, folks. But for the Facebook Live aspect of this discussion, in conjunction with the Pulitzer Center, I'm going to ask each of you to just give a quick summary of what we've talked about thus far, and we again can continue this discussion. We'll start with Tarun.
So this discussion crystallizes for me that system of inequity that's existed for centuries has been so resistant to any kind of reform, whether policy reform, reform using technology, reform using edification through education, what have you. And in that sense, it's sobering.
Kavita?
I went into this thinking that caste has not affected my life or the lives of people I knew, other Indian Americans, and I have come away with a whole new understanding of it. And I certainly with more questions than answers, and I think that's a great thing. I think the thing that I really came away from working on this series was what are the stories that we tell ourselves about, especially around caste, and I think that's maybe my biggest question going forward.
Okay, Larry?
I come away with the feeling that cultures change slowly, particularly if most people believe that issues of caste are embedded in their religions. If so, that is very hard to root out, even over centuries. And we do need not only educational efforts, but social policies that address these very deep discriminations.
All right, Swami?
I think it sort of redoubles our commitment, as we've always said. We've always think this is an important issue to address and to eradicate. We would like to see this, we would like to see caste as a social evil that should go, but also as something that's distinct from the core precepts and practices of Hinduism itself.
Okay, finally, Suraj.
I think it's a newer era for American public to understand and engage with the question of caste, and this is going to be part of their public and private life. And now this is a new dynamic that they have to add in order to make this already complex system and make it more fruitful. And I think many research has to be done in order to we have a solidified evidence to work on it.
Okay, thank you. I want to thank our panelists. And we have been discussing caste in America. This is a Facebook Live broadcast here at Boston Public Library, sponsored by WGBH. These are our studios, of course, and PRI's The World in conjunction with the Pulitzer Center. Would also like you to take a listen if you haven't heard it already, our series, Caste in America, WGBHnews.com.org. Let's try that again, .org. And we look forward to your questions if you'd like to send them to WGBH, or you can send them to me directly. Phillip, it's 2 L's _Martin at WGBH.org. Thank you very much, our panelists. We will now turn to our audience and to the post-Facebook Live aspect of this. We have some additional questions from our audience, and I'm going to read some of these. Swami, there's a question directed to you directly. It says, different individuals of the same family can have different varnas. We have never seen this happen in India. If you are Brahmin, you remain Brahmin, irrespective of how bad your character and behavior is. If This is a long question.
But I get the gist of the question. I can answer
please,
that.
go on.
The way he started off is true. That was how original Vedic society was. Vedas are the closest equivalent of the Bible for the Hindus, let me put it that way. And it's something that's been acknowledged by Ambedkar himself. If you read some of his writings, he points out that not only that people of different varnas or different apparent varnas could be in the same family, but also people were, Ambedkar called it mainly a class system, and people could change classes. But at some point in history, and you could argue till the cows come home exactly when that happened, there was a change when being a Brahmin or being a Kshatriya became hereditary, became birth-based. So eventually, when it became birth-based, in my mind at least, that's really when it became a problem. Because if you think about it before, if it was by choice, it could be seen more as somebody opting to be a priest. If anybody could become a priest, or if anybody could become a soldier, there really isn't a problem in terms of recognizing a class of priests and a class of soldiers any more than today you have problems calling people as doctors and engineers and politicians and so on. The problem really comes when you lose occupational mobility and make it birth-based. That really was the issue, and when you create a hierarchy. So again, the question is, yes, it was that way, and it became a problem later on.
Isn't this we get into interpretations of history and interpretations of the provenance of castes with this type of discussion. What is the fundamental point of departure that any of you might have with this interpretation of history? Do you have a fundamental point of departure, or do you endorse the history as articulated by Swami? Anyone?
I don't have a point of view.
Okay.
Not informed about
All right.
this.
All right. Anyone informed? All right. These two questions, we dealt with this in some ways, but this is really worth, I think, asking. Controversially, there are two questions here. One person asked, in the USA, Dalits may say, at least I am not black. How would you respond to this? And the second question someone asked, and we dealt with this in some ways, in the US, do you think caste equals class equals racism? Question mark. Yeah. Anyone?
That's a very sound, that's a very poignant intervention, actually. US caste is equal to race and class, I think that would go well with the way we understand, at least the American caste system. One of the things Swami had initially mentioned, I think he's right with the Ambedkar's intervention of it being classes and then eventually gets solidified. I think the cunning Brahmins and their progenies up until now continue to carry the same argument, which is unfounded, although there is a but. You will say this is bad, but and that but, comma, whatever follows is the justification for what is on table right now. Now, if you want to really go with the hermeneutical intervention of caste or this religious text, it's such a complex. There are 4 Vedas, and the Smritis and Shrutis. There is a lot going on there too, but the very premise that you are by birth someone, and what happened in history, my ancestors underwent this kind of oppression, I'm not willing to forego that. But even now, that is happening, by very virtue of my grandparent or my forefather were untouchables, I'm born into that, and there is no escape to that. Is there a system where we can really revisit this? And for me, personally, I don't want even hierarchy. Just get rid of it. We don't need to have these gradations, which is strictly, which Ambedkar defines as a closed class. There's no mobility. Why do we even need to go back and talk about it? Let's start it. But how do we do that? For that, we need to abolish all of this priesthood that we have. Brahmins continue to be the default priests of temples in India. And Ambedkar...
You're saying that you should abolish the the priesthood? Is that
Oh, indeed. They are the problems that whatever we have, recurring in our system. Now, you can talk about spirituality, I'm all for it. But how can you talk about spirituality to a person who's been beaten, who's been hacked? If his procession is going outside or his daughter is under constant threat. We can talk about this attainment of a certain nirvana once my material needs are fulfilled. And in contemporary society, unless that is all set, we will then engage, of course, with spiritual definitions. But to put spiritualism in front of the horse is going to be a great disaster.
Would many people, go ahead, Larry, I'm sorry.
If I may, I think I have a letter that I received a few days ago from the Dalai Lama about the launching of the journal. And if I may just read one paragraph, because I think following Suraj's excellent comments, he presents the issue in the most simple way. And he says, when I meet people, and he's speaking as the Dalai Lama, when I meet people, I don't think about being different from them, about being a Tibetan, a Buddhist, or even the Dalai Lama. I only think about being a human being. And he goes on to say, I am therefore pleased to know that this journal, Caste, a global journal of social exclusion at Brandeis University, is being launched to advance the study of caste and social policies. The caste system, from what I know of its prevalence in any place, is really outdated. I feel that it is a vestige of feudalism. Through education, as your journal aspires to do, we can promote a sense of the oneness of the 7 billion human beings. It's a beautifully simple statement, and now I know it's a long way from telling us how do we totally eradicate it, but from a spiritual point of view, His Holiness the 14th Dalai Lama, I think, is giving us some direction.
It's quite a letter, by the way.
Yes, it is.
Anyone else on this point? Another question, and I'm just going to try to interpret this. It's a bit long. Is why a lot of people are asking? They're sitting in their living rooms at Burlington, Massachusetts. People of South Asian descent, or they're at Harvard, Massachusetts, or in Brighton or Brookline, and carrying out their lives and wondering, is this overly academic, this discussion, or do you see there are practical applications and solutions to this issue in the everyday world, if you will?
I think there's so many forms of exclusion that we have to deal with on a daily basis. And earlier we had a question about the relevance of the experiences with race to the caste question, right? So I think similarly, somebody who is disconnected from this caste issue, perhaps by virtue of not being connected to South Asia, I think there's a lot for them to learn from the fact that this insidious principle has been so difficult. I mean, everybody on this panel is agreeing in violent agreement that it would be nice if we got rid of this effect. But that's very far from actually making progress towards the Dalai Lama's aspirational statement. I mean, the one positive thing that I would like to say, Phillip, is that at least growing up in urban India and in my own adulthood in this country, operating organizations that work in India, once we were able to provide a technical basis for comparing people on a particular dimension, I do want to say that I think issues like caste and even gender, which are more visible, if you could obscure them from the decision to include somebody in a process, tended to fade away. So that's a little bit more of an optimistic view of fundamental human nature. And I'm an optimist, so I prefer to see things.
The notion of objective measurements.
Yeah, some idea of objectivity. Now, that's not without its own faults, because who's to decide what's the objective measure for a particular criterion? I recognize that. But I think it's something that should be in the mix of things that instruments to address these sorts of things.
Anyone else? I'm going to turn to this question then, and let me just keep an eye on the clock here. Someone in our audience here asked, how did Gandhi feel about caste?
Gandhi gave the life to the dying part of orthodoxy. He is the creator, and he is the new modern, we call in political Manu.
Political.
The guy who is basically the creator of all these injunctions and the laws of Manu Smriti. Gandhi's life is such a complicated. That guy helped Hinduism live long, at least politically, for another 100 or 200 years. And he was shot by the same Brahminical thinking who used him, another Baniya. And this is where the whole strategy goes. The Brahmins in India want to retain their position, whichever dominance they want to be. And Gandhi comes as one who never experienced caste, experienced more of a color, and that too a color of a higher, where he gets kicked out from a first class cabin way out of India in South Africa, where he realizes that, oh, I am also inferior. So, I mean, if you have to go to a first-class cabin to South Africa to experience your secondary position, Gandhi comes to India and ushers the life where he spiritualizes the filthy practice of manual scavenging. When Ambedkar is saying, let's get rid of this malice that we have, he just fantasizes this, and then he breathes this fresh air by saying, never ever condemns that this practice needs to be abolished, and we all need to. And so when we talk about caste, we are basically talking about this vocation, How do we deal with this? But again, Gandhi again comes as a complicated figure where he's not too orthodox at one point, and then he becomes a problem maker for the people, because he talks about this universal morality between Hinduism and Islam and other, but for the caste, he doesn't want that to be projection. He says this is our quote-unquote internal matter. We are like, we are not internal matter. We are separate than you, and we have our own humanity. And I think that's what Gandhi has been done.
Well, certainly one of the great, thank you very much, one of the great conflicts, it seems, in Indian history was the disagreements, vocal and written disagreements between Ambedkar and Gandhi. We don't have time, obviously, to talk about that here, but we certainly ask folks to, you're in a library, to take a look at that history. It's quite intriguing. It informs part of this discussion. We're going to take a few more minutes with this discussion. And let me just ask folks if you could talk about keep all these together. This question from a viewer earlier: having lived through the caste system in Nepal, but born Buddhist, my experience in Nepal was that religion was intertwined into the caste system and had a negative impact. However, unlike India, which is a secular country, Nepal until 2008 was defined a Hindu nation by the Constitution. I am wondering if the panel could comment on whether this religious exemption really existed in the caste system in India.
What's the religious exemption being talked about?
I'm hoping you might know, because
I mean, we've talked about caste discrimination.
Maybe is he talking about Buddhist?
This individual is talking about being born Buddhist, but yet living in a caste-based system, and wondering if, I'm not sure which religious exemption the person's referring to. My knowledge is not that deep. I'm hoping that one of you might be able to answer that. We will move on. Okay. I think at this point there's one other question here, but I'd like someone in addition to Swami to address this. This is addressed to you, Swami, but I think others should also talk about this. It says that let's try this again. Humans-made religion, caste originated from Hinduism. Understood you're here representing the Hindu American Foundation. Why is it more important for you to defend a religion than focus on the humanitarian issues associated with caste? And I think others should also chime in on this. What is that? But the question, it's directed initially to you.
I think the question is posed as this or that. And I don't think it is this or that. That's all we're saying. There's no question of not focusing on the humanitarian aspects of caste. There's no question of not doing your utmost to eradicate caste. But it doesn't have to. But it doesn't have to be that if you want to understand Hindu teachings for what they are, spiritual teachings for what they are, that doesn't tantamount to saying that I'm going to ignore caste and let it be what they are. It doesn't have to, it's not a choice, it's both.
Okay, anyone else? Suraj?
See, Hindu as a word, or Hinduism, is a political category. We have to understand that. It didn't exist until the mid-19th century as a Hindu word. Even in the sacred text, there's no mention of Hindu. It's a political invocation to unite. And when Brahmins thought that they are minority and their privileges are going away, they unite. And for example, Indian National Congress is the conglomeration of all these Brahmins coming together to say we need to front a political battle against this because they saw their power being withdrawn. And so when we are talking about Hinduism, I think let's be clear that it's a political project. And that's why when someone asked me, or the question was asked about Gandhi, I'm referring to the political Hinduism that, he kind of gave a life, he leased a life to the otherwise, dormant aspects. Now we can go about mystifying and fanciful interpretations of all this hippie culture that we had, and which is true, admit, but also it's borrowed from Buddhism. We have to be very clear on that, And Ambedkar clearly mentions that in his Revolution and Counter-Revolution. These are Buddhist principles that are being taken, and Buddhist, of course, temples and the viharas were desecrated, and the monks were killed en masse by the invading kingdoms of the so-called Brahminic order. Hinduism, that's why, will not give us any more offer because there doesn't exist as such. We have accepted it as a common category for us to work together, but primarily it's this varnas, it's this caste, it's jatis, where Brahmin have their own ritual, Kshatriyas have their own ritual, Dalits are again outcast, and this is how the foundation is. But what we have done is we have projected it, it's a diverse culture. It is this great thing, and I think we need to probably question that.
I think that's probably the first point where I would disagree with what Suraj has said, really. The word Christianity doesn't occur in the Bible. That doesn't mean that Christianity as a religion does not exist. So the idea of Hinduism as a pluralist religion of many different paths, it is true. A lot of different traditions and different ways of approaching the divine. But the concept that there are different ways of approaching the divine is very old. It's there in the very first Veda itself. Ekam sat vipraha bahuda vadanti, which means the truth is one and the wise men call it in different names. So the idea of pluralism has always been there. So where perhaps we differ the most is perhaps this idea that you have to deny the existence of Hinduism as a religion, to insist that in order to be Hindu, you have to practice caste discrimination. These are some of the areas where I find myself in disagreement with caste activists. I'm not able to, I cannot accept this idea that Hinduism as a concept, because the whole body of knowledge has come over a long period of time. It's existed since at least 3,500 years. Many people say more, but no one disputes this whole body of knowledge as being existing for 3,500 years at least.
See, one of my people tell me that there are so many religions in India, you guys are so spiritually rich. No, people were fed up, and that's why they went on, formed different religions. Sikhism is an outcome of that. We have various religions, Buddhism, for example, Buddha and, Mahavira. So we have these different big religions, and pluralism as it may be, but they were tired of this. They were like, we can't deal with the system, and that's why they went to form they went their own ways, right? And they said, we can't deal with this mess right now, and that's the outcome. So we talk about pluralism, but we also have to talk about these inconsistencies that remain in this.
Larry, it's clear we're not going to
Maybe
solve
people of
this.
Israel were tired of Judaism and went to Christianity. I mean, so it's sort of, I think positioning Sikhism or Buddhism as being people tired of Hinduism is also, because Buddhism as a separate religion owes a lot to the fact that it went outside of India. Within India, Buddha was another revered teacher by all Hindus as well. So it's just there, and there were several other teachers like the Buddha. So I think there would be some differences in how you see that, but I would still say I don't think there's any disagreement in terms of getting rid of the problem of caste or caste discrimination.
I think this is a fascinating discussion, and we're going to wind it down. Larry?
The Buddha himself permitted people of all castes to come and study with him. That, in those years particularly, that was a almost revolutionary statement, frankly. Mm-hmm. And that is why a lot of the Ambedkarites who have emerged in India, or since Dr. Ambedkar's great teachings and great service, have converted to Buddhism. the question for us, I guess, is do you need to convert to another religion in order to continue to be a person of Dalit background or other oppressed communities in India? I worked in Latin America during the rise of liberation theology. And, you know, as I was a young Jewish kid, but I was working with Catholic priests and sisters who had their sleeves rolled up, working at the grassroots on a social gospel, and they believed that they were bringing Catholicism in Latin America back to the original words and intent of Jesus. All the great religions have gone through reformations. I think what I'm hearing within India is kind of a people waiting with anticipation. Will Hinduism be able to achieve a kind of reformation? Not just Sikhism and a few other efforts that have been made, but will Hinduism be able to find a reformation to jettison some of the original doctrines, at least as they perhaps crept into what is today understood as Hinduism, to really lead the people of India through a social reformation?
Larry, thank you. That's going to have to be the last word on this conversation. An extraordinary conversation, an important conversation, Caste in America. Again, folks, you can listen and read the series and continue this discussion, if you will, online, and get in touch with any of these folks. What are your Twitter handles? If
My
you
name,
will?
Suraj Yengde.
Okay. Anyone else?
Swami, HAF.
You don't have one, right?
I don't have it, but I'm Simon at Brandeis Study to you.
There you go.
I'm K, B as in boy, Pillay, P-I-L-L-A-Y.
Tarun, Khanna, HBS.
Okay, and I gave up mine earlier, Phillip Martin at WGBH. We have been talking to Tarun, Khanna, Kavita Pillay, Larry Simon, Swami Venkataraman, and Suraj Yengde. And I want to thank our audience and thank the studio people here for doing an extraordinary job. Sam, thank you for the shout out. And we will conclude this program with a massive congratulations to all of you.
Thank you.
Thank you all.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.